So, the study we're about to do is a study on the word iniquity. What is iniquity and what does it mean and where did it come from? There's a war taking place in the cosmic realm between Jesus Christ and Satan. In Revelation 12:7 and 8, it reads, "And there was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon fought and his angels, and prevailed not. Neither was their place found any more in heaven." In Revelation 12:3 it says, "Another sign was seen in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head 7 crowns." In Revelation 12:9, "And the great red dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him." Now in Ezekiel 28:15-16, speaking about Lucifer, it says, "You were perfect in your ways from the day that you were created till iniquity was found in you. By the multitude of your merchandise they have filled your midst with violence, and you have sinned." Lucifer's merchandise, iniquity, had filled him with violence. The symbolism surround Lucifer portrays his violence. He went from being the most honored being in heaven to being the great red dragon. Red, the color of blood. In Leviticus 16, the goat that symbolizes Satan has a red ribbon around his horns, and horns represents his government, and his government is filled with blood, which means it's filled with death. In Hebrews 1 verse 8, in contrast, speaking about Jesus Christ, it says, "But unto the Son he, God, said, Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You have loved righteousness and hated iniquity. Therefore God, even your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows." And this is a direct quote from Psalm 45:6. Speaking about Jesus Christ in Isaiah 53, verse 9, it says, "And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth." Jesus is portrayed as the white lamb without spot. White being a symbol of purity and peace, non-violence. Righteousness. Jesus hates iniquity. He had done no violence. Righteousness fills him with gladness, and there was no deceit in his mouth. Now, Jesus used the word iniquity only 5 times in the New Testament, and we're going to go through these. And each time this word was used, it was in the context of deception. The first one is in Matthew 7:15. And he says, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. You shall know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes of thorns or figs of thistles? Even so, every good tree brings forth good fruit, but a corrupt tree brings forth evil fruit. A good tree cannot bring forth evil fruit, neither can a corrupt tree bring forth good fruit. Every tree that brings not forth good fruit is hewn down and cast into the fire. Wherefore, by their fruits you shall know them. Not every one that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name? And in your name have cast out devils? And in your name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. So false prophets are ravening wolves. They are corrupt trees, therefore they bring forth corrupt fruit. They do not do the will of the Father, but they do prophesy, and they do cast out demons. They do wonderful works, and yet they are workers of iniquity. They have been serving the dragon, not Jesus. And Jesus says to them, "Depart from me, I do not know you." So who was deceiving in this section where Jesus spoke? It was the false prophets. And who was deceived? The workers of iniquity themselves. The second time Jesus uses the word iniquity is found in Matthew 13:25. And it says, "Another parable put he forth unto them, saying, The kingdom of heaven is likened unto a man which sowed good seeds in his field. But while men slept, his enemy came and sowed tares among the wheat, and went his way. But when the blade was sprung up and brought forth fruit, then appeared the tares also. So the servants of the householder came and said unto him, Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? From whence then has it tares? And he said unto them, An enemy has done this. The servants said unto him, Will you then that we go and gather them up? But he said, Nay, lest while you gather up the tares, you root up also the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And in the time of harvest I will say to the reapers, Gather together first the tares, and bind them in bundles to burn them, but gather the wheat into my barn. Then Jesus sent the multitude away, and went into the house. And his disciples came unto him, saying, Declare unto us the parable of the tares of the field. He answered and said unto them, He that sows the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, the good seed are the children of the kingdom, but the tares are the children of the wicked one. The enemy that sowed them is the devil, the harvest is the end of the world, and the reapers are the angels. As therefore the tares are gathered and burned in the fire, so shall it be in the end of this world. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity. So where is the deception? The workers of iniquity grow together with the wheat, and it's almost impossible to tell them apart. The end of the world will disclose who they are. The tares, they look deceptively like the wheat. They grow together with the wheat. They were sown by an enemy, the devil. They grow from the seed of the devil, the seed of iniquity. And iniquity offends, and it will be rooted out. The contrast is clear. Jesus Christ sows the good seeds, the wheat, the seeds of righteousness. The next time that Jesus uses the word iniquity is in Matthew 23:27. And he says, Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you are like unto whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones and of all uncleanliness. Even so you also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within you are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. The word hypocrite means an actor under an assumed character, a dissembler, a hypocrite. Where is the deception? In the scribes and Pharisees, the teachers of the people, the preachers and the book writers, the scribes. On the outside, they appear beautiful and righteous, but on the inside, they are filled with uncleanliness, iniquity. The scribes and the Pharisees on the outside appear pure, but inside they are impure, filled with iniquity. The next time Jesus uses the word iniquity is in Matthew 24:11. And many false prophets shall arise and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. Where again is the deception? It's in the false prophets. According to these verses, iniquity will abound at the end time. To abound means to increase, to multiply, which also means that deception will abound at the end time, which also means that violence will abound at the end time. False prophets shall deceive many with iniquity. Their teachings lead many to lose their agape love, which is righteousness, the opposite of iniquity. As a result, people's agape love will grow cold. When iniquity abounds, agape love diminishes. The fifth time Jesus uses the word iniquity is in Luke 13:27, which is the same as in Matthew 7. And he ends, "But he shall say unto you, I tell you, I know you not whence you are. Depart from me, workers of iniquity." Now in Revelation 12:9, it says that the great dragon was cast out, that old serpent called the devil and Satan, which deceives the whole world. He was cast out into the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So what deceives the whole world? The dragon, and the dragon is filled with iniquity. In Revelation 3:14, it says, "And unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans write, These things said the Amen, the faithful and the true witness, the beginning of the creation of God." Jesus is the only faithful and true witness, and he is not filled with iniquity. In all the passages we read, iniquity was paired up with deception. And who was Jesus talking about in these passages? In Matthew 27:21, "Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven." Who is he talking to? People that call him Lord. They are believers. In Matthew 7:15, "Beware of false prophets, which come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves." Beware of who? False prophets, believers. Matthew 7:15 and to 22, "But many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works?" Again, these are believers. "And I will profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity." They thought they knew him. And even so, also outwardly, they appear to be righteous unto men, but within they're full of hypocrisy and iniquity. "And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many," the love of who? The love of believers will grow cold. So this is the end of this slide show, and the next time we're going to look at the word iniquity and what exactly it means. This is the second study on the word iniquity, the mystery of iniquity. And we saw that deception goes along with the word iniquity. And deception is always more effective when it's done through wonders, especially religious wonders. Modern day false teachers come in many disguises. They come as religious and secular preachers, religious and secular books, religious and secular television, religious and secular movies, religious and secular music, religious and secular culture, religious and secular government. From all that Jesus said, deception comes primarily from religious sources. Why? Because that's where believers place their trust. Most believers do not trust the world anyway, but they do trust their religious leaders. What better place for deception to come from? So, as a summary from last time, iniquity began in Lucifer. Iniquity is the opposite of righteousness. How does Jesus feel about iniquity? Hebrews chapter 1 says he hates it. Because it appears to be righteousness, iniquity is deceptive. And yet, iniquity appears to be righteousness. False teachers teach iniquity and pass it for righteousness. Those who use it are called workers of iniquity. Iniquity may be known by its fruits. Jesus' warnings were directed specially to believers. And here's a bonus question. In the beginning, iniquity deceived how many angels? The Bible says that it deceived 1/3 of the stars of heaven. That means the angels. So you can see how deceptive iniquity is. It's extremely deceptive. So who may we trust? The Bible is very clear. Call no man your father upon the earth, for one is your Father which is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. Now the word master is kategetes. It's a guide, a teacher, a master. That's where the word catechism comes from. So God made it very easy for us. How can we discern deception? By beholding Jesus Christ, first and foremost. By staying connected with God through prayer, through studying the scriptures, by getting to know God and his principles. Lucifer hates Jesus. He comes as an angel of light and keeps Jesus out of the equation. Or he uses Jesus' name, but gives him his own character. Or he says that man has power in and of himself. So, the word iniquity in the Bible, there are 6 Hebrew words and 3 Greek words that describe the word iniquity. So we can start with the Hebrew. Moral evil, the first word. Ola, avla, avel, evel, avel, avla, ola, ola. Evil, iniquity, perverseness, moral evil, unjust, unrighteousness. The second word, Hebrew word, is aval, and it means to distort morally, to deal unjustly, unrighteously. That was the word from which that first word came. This is the second Hebrew word, avon, perversity, that is moral evil, fault, iniquity, mischief, punishment of iniquity, sin. And it comes from ava, which means to crook, do amiss, bow down, make crooked again, perversion. The third word, aven, comes from an unused root, perhaps meaning properly to pant. Strictly nothingness, wickedness, an idol, vanity. And it comes from another Hebrew word, which is a primitive root meaning to be nothing or not exist. That's connected to that nothingness concept, non-entity. Okay, so the fourth Hebrew word is hava, in the sense of eagerly coveting and rushing upon, by implication of falling. It's a desire, also ruin, calamity, iniquity, mischief. Okay. And it comes from the word rasha, to be wrong, by implication, to disturb, violate, condemn, make trouble. Okay, the fifth word is resha. It's a wrong, especially a moral wrong, iniquity, wickedness. And it comes from alva, which is moral perverseness, iniquity. The sixth word, it means moral evil, iniquity. So the Hebrew words undeniably place the word iniquity in the context of morality. According to these definitions, iniquity is a moral evil, a moral distortion, a moral perverseness, to go amiss, punishment, wickedness, unrighteousness, violation, condemnation, and disturbance. Notice that the word iniquity can also mean punishment and condemnation. There is an element of crookedness to iniquity because it both deceives and misrepresents. Iniquity is also nothingness, non-existence. Now, what is morality? A definition says that it is the principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. It is behavior as it is affected by the observation of these principles. Okay. Synonyms of morality: moral, morals, ethic, virtue. Iniquity is a perversion of what is right and wrong. The Greek words for the word iniquity are, the first one, anomia. It's illegality, that is, violation of law, or generally wickedness, iniquity, to transgress the law. That's unrighteousness. It comes from another Greek word called, which is anomos. Again, lawless, not subject to law, without law, lawless. Okay, the second word is adikia. It's legal injustice. Okay, moral wrongfulness. And it comes from the word adikos, which is unjust, by extension wicked. So unjust. The third word is paranomia. It's transgression. And it comes from the word paranomeo, to be opposed to law, that is, to transgress, contrary to law. So the Greek words for iniquity place it in the context of law. Lawlessness, violation of law, illegality, transgression of law, injustice, opposition to law, as well as moral wrongfulness. So here we have the word iniquity in the Hebrew and the Greek. And in the Hebrew, it's mainly a distortion of the true moral law, a transgression of the true moral law. And in the Greek, it's a distortion or transgression of God's law of ethics in a way that uses violence. So Hebrew, moral evil, to distort morally, perversity, moral evil, punishment, to crook, do amiss, pervert, nothingness, vanity, trouble, wickedness, to be nothing or not exist, desire, ruin, coveting, to be wrong, to disturb, to violate, condemn, make trouble, a wrong, especially moral, and moral perverseness. And in the Greek, illegality, violation of law, lawless, not subject to Jewish law, injustice, moral wrongfulness, unjust, wicked, treacherous, transgression, to be opposed to law, to transgress, contrary to law. So the question we have to ask is, iniquity is a perversion of what? Which moral law? Which moral law was in place before iniquity came into being? According to the Bible, it was God's moral law. And what is God's moral law? It's the law of love, which is his character, agape love, unconditional, self-sacrificing love. And so then we have to ask the question, what is agape love? The only answer we have as human beings is Jesus Christ, because agape love was exemplified only by Jesus Christ. He is the only example of agape love we can look at. There is no other one among human beings. That is God's moral law. What is agape love? There is a wonderful explanation of it in the translator's preface to Ender Nygren's book called Agape and Eros by Philip Watson. It says, God's love, agape, in the fullest sense of the term, has neither the appetitive nature of eros nor the responsive character of faith. It is entirely independent of external stimulus and motivation. God loves because it is his nature to love, and his loving consists not in getting but in doing good. Agape is further distinguished from eros in that it is indifferent to value. That is to say, it is neither kindled by the attractiveness nor quenched by the unattractiveness of its object. This is seen most clearly in God's love for sinners who are loved in spite of their sin. Not that God prefers sinful to righteous men, or that sinners are somehow more worthy of his love. His loving is not determined by the worthiness or unworthiness of those whom he loves, but by his own nature of love. God's very essence, his nature, is love. His love is independent of external stimulus. It's indifferent to value. He loves everyone in the same way. He is impartial. His love is determined by his own nature of love. His love is not determined by the criteria of merit or demerit, worthiness or unworthiness. Now, Satan's essence, his nature, is iniquity. His ethical system is dependent of external stimulus. His ethical system is not indifferent to value. He does not treat everyone in the same way. He is partial. His ethical system is determined by the criteria of merit or demerit, worthiness or unworthiness. The law of God is the law of freedom. This is taken from Patriarchs and Prophets. The law of God being the foundation of the government of God, the happiness of all intelligent beings depends upon their perfect accord with its great principles of righteousness. God desires from all his creatures the service of love, service that springs from an appreciation of his character. He takes no pleasure in a forced obedience, and to all he grants freedom of will, that they may render him voluntary service. So long as all created beings acknowledged the allegiance of love, there was perfect harmony throughout the universe. What are the great principles of righteousness? Freedom of choice, freedom of will, voluntary obedience, and the service of love. The law of freedom. God might have created man without the power to transgress his law. He might have withheld the hand of Adam from touching the forbidden fruit. But in that case, man would have been not a free moral agent, but a mere automaton. Without freedom of choice, his obedience would not have been voluntary, but forced. There could have been no development of character. Such a course would have been contrary to God's plan in dealing with the inhabitants of other worlds. It would have been unworthy of man as an intelligent being, and would have sustained Satan's charge of God's arbitrary rule. So God desires from all his creatures the service of love, a service that springs from an appreciation of his character. He takes no pleasure in a forced obedience. To all he grants the freedom of will, freedom of choice. He desires voluntary service. The allegiance of love ensures perfect harmony. Jesus said that if he was lifted up, he would draw all people to himself, because he takes no pleasure in forcing people to obey him. The allegiance of love ensures perfect harmony. Now, Patriarchs and Prophets again says, there was one who perverted the freedom that God had granted to his creatures. Sin originated with him who next to Christ had been most honored of God and was highest in power and glory among the inhabitants of heaven. If freedom is removed, force takes its place. If obedience is forced, obedience is no longer voluntary. Lucifer created a forced obedience. Man no longer develops character. Through forced obedience, Satan perverted the freedom God had given us. Through forced obedience, Satan made us all into slaves. The discord which his own course had caused in heaven, Satan charged upon the government of God. All evil he declared to be the result of divine administration. He claimed that it was his own object to improve upon the statutes of Jehovah. Therefore, God permitted him to demonstrate the nature of his claims, to show the working out of his proposed changes in the divine law. His own work must condemn him. Satan had claimed from the first that he was not in rebellion. The whole universe must see the deceiver unmasked. So Lucifer perverted the freedom God had given his creatures. Lucifer claimed that he could improve upon the statutes of Jehovah. He introduced proposed changes in the divine law, and he introduced iniquity, a moral perversion. How Satan proposed to change God's law? In the opening of the great controversy, Satan had declared that the law of God could not be obeyed, that justice was inconsistent with mercy, and that should the law be broken, it would be impossible for the sinner to be pardoned. Every sin must meet its punishment, urged Satan, and if God should remit the punishment of sin, he would not be a God of truth and justice. When men broke the law of God and defied his will, Satan exulted. It was proved, he declared, that the law could not be obeyed, man could not be forgiven. Because he, after his rebellion, had been banished from heaven, Satan claimed that the human race must be forever shut out from God's favor. God could not be just, he urged, and yet show mercy to the sinner. Satan had told God that God's mercy was inconsistent with what justice should be. He implied that God's justice, meaning his agape love, was not good enough. He told God that every sin must meet its punishment. How can God give mercy to the transgressor? Satan had a new definition of justice, one based on the worthiness or unworthiness of the individual. Satan perverted God's moral law by instituting a system of merit and demerit, whereby those who were unworthy would be punished and those who were worthy would be rewarded. This is how force and violence came into being. Again, there's one word in the Hebrew, avon, which means iniquity, but which also can mean punishment. And there's a good example of how that is used in Genesis 4:13. It says, "And Cain said unto the Lord, My punishment," the word iniquity, "is greater than I can bear." In 1 John 4:16, we read that, "And we have known and believed the love that God has towards us. God is love, and he that dwells in love dwells in God, and God in him. Herein is our love made perfect, that we may have boldness in the day of judgment, because as he is, so are we in this world. There is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear, because fear has torment. He that fears is not made perfect in love." Now, I want to take that word torment and look at the Greek meaning. It's the word kolasis, and it means penal infliction, punishment, torment. So, does God use the system of merit and demerit? It is not the fear of punishment or the hope of everlasting reward that leads the disciples of Christ to follow him. They behold the Savior's matchless love revealed through his pilgrimage on earth, from the manger of Bethlehem to Calvary's cross, and the sight of him attracts. It softens and subdues the soul. Love awakens in the heart of the beholders. They hear his voice and they follow him. Lucifer's distorted moral law brought self-exaltation. In the days of Christ, the Pharisees were continually trying to earn the favor of heaven in order to secure the worldly honor and prosperity which they regarded as the reward of virtue. At the same time, they paraded their acts of charity before the people in order to attract their attention and gain a reputation for sanctity. So it's very clear to see that the spirit of self-exaltation is totally connected with the reward part of Satan's principle of reward and punishment. Heaven looking down and seeing the delusions into which men were led, the delusions of the reward and punishment system, the merit and demerit system, heaven knew that a divine instructor must come to earth. Men in ignorance and moral darkness must have light, spiritual light. For the world knew not God, and he must be revealed to their understanding. Truth looked down from heaven and saw not the reflection of her image. For dense clouds of moral darkness that moral perversion, iniquity, and gloom enveloped the world, and the Lord Jesus alone was able to roll back the clouds, for he was the light of the world. By his presence he could dissipate the gloomy shadow that Satan had cast between man and God. Darkness covered the earth, and gross darkness the people. Through the accumulated misrepresentations of the enemy, many were so deceived that they worshipped a false god, clothed with the attributes of the satanic character. So what did Lucifer's iniquity do to the human race? It removed man's freedom. Obedience was no longer voluntary. It created a forced obedience. As a result, under Satan's system, man cannot develop character. Thus Satan perverted the freedom God had given his creatures. He claimed he was improving God's statutes. His proposed changes to the divine law removed freedom. Instead of grace, Satan said that every sin must meet its punishment. He said that justice was not compatible with mercy. Pharisaism encapsulates Satan's proposed changes to God's law. Continual striving to earn the favor of heaven, to earn a reward. His proposed changes to God's law were that the law, the moral law, should be based on fear of punishment and hope of reward. Ezekiel 28:15 said that he was perfect in his ways from the day that he was created till iniquity was found in him. By the multitude of his merchandise they have filled his midst with violence, and he sinned. The principles of Satan's working in heaven are the same principles by which he works through human agents in this world. It is through these corrupting principles that every earthly empire and the churches have been increasingly corrupted. It is by the working out of these principles that Satan deceives and corrupts the world from the beginning to the ending. He is continuing the same policy working originally begun in the heavenly universe. He is energizing the whole world with his violence with which he corrupted the world in the days of Noah. The word violence in Hebrew is Hamas, by implication wrong, unjust gain, cruelty, damage, false injustice, dealing wrongly. And it comes from the word Hamas, a primitive root to be violent, by implication to maltreat, to make bare, to shake off, violate, to do violence. The Hebrew and the Arabic are very similar. Hamas. The Arabic word Hamas also means devotion and zeal in the path of Allah. The Hamas covenant interprets its meaning to mean strength and bravery, but it's violence done in the name of God, in the name of morality. In Matthew 7:21-23, God's will is that we be perfect in agape love. Not everyone that says unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that does the will of my Father which is in heaven. So God's will is that we be perfect in agape love as he is perfect in agape love, giving freedom of will and choice, living by the voluntary service of love and the great principle of righteousness, and treating each other in the same way, not using violence to enforce morality. In Matthew 7:21-23, it says, Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, and in your name have cast out devils, and in your name done many wonderful works? These deceived followers thought they were doing wonderful things in God's name, but they were using violence to obtain their goals. They were deceived because they thought they were doing good by using violent means. And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you that work iniquity. The workers of iniquity are enemies of the true God. They work not for him, but against him. The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity. So if Jesus said these words, will God use violence at the end to clean up his kingdom? Will God, who hates iniquity and violence, resort to iniquity and violence? Or will those things that offend remove themselves, like Judas did, because they are filled with violence? In Matthew 24:12 it says, and because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall grow cold. Iniquity is based on the knowledge or awareness that someone is good or evil, and it is therefore conditional. And that's how love grows cold and disappears, when we start judging each other and thinking that we must punish each other for our evil acts. Iniquity is the opposite of unconditional love. Its good is dependent on external stimulus. Its love is dependent on value. Iniquity does not treat everyone in the same way. In Isaiah 61:1, it says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound. This was directed especially towards the system of government that Satan instituted on earth. We were bound by this system of force and violence, and Jesus came to bring good tidings. In 2 Timothy 2:19, the Lord knows them that are his, and let everyone that names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. In Titus 2:14, Christ gave himself for us, that he might redeem us from all iniquity, and purify unto himself a peculiar people, zealous of good works, good agape works. Unconditional love. Iniquity flourished in Egypt. In fact, the exodus from Egypt to Canaan is a type of leaving Satan's government of iniquity and entering God's law of love and mercy. This is a quote from Ellen White. It says, I am filled with sadness when I think of our condition as a people. The Lord has not closed heaven to us, but our own course of continual backsliding has separated us from God. And yet, the general opinion is that the church is flourishing, and that peace and spiritual prosperity are in all her borders. The church has turned back from following Christ, her leader, and is steadily retreating toward Egypt. So the next slide, group of slides shows that I will do will be on Egypt. So this is a continuation of a series of studies on the word iniquity, on the mystery of iniquity. And this is part 3. Just to recap what we have covered so far, iniquity began in Lucifer. It began inside of him. And how does Jesus feel about iniquity? He hates it according to Hebrews. And iniquity is the opposite of righteousness, which is what Jesus is all about. And yet, iniquity does appear to be righteousness because it deceives those who use it. False teachers teach iniquity and pass it for righteousness. They are deceived and they deceive others with it. Iniquity filled Lucifer with violence. And Jesus, by contrast, had done no violence, according to Jeremiah 53. And because it appears to be righteousness, iniquity is extremely deceptive. It deceived a third of the angels, and it deceived Adam and Eve. Jesus called those who use it as workers of iniquity, and iniquity may be known by its fruits. And Jesus' warnings about iniquity were directed specially to believers. In the Hebrew language, there are 6 words that define the word iniquity. And in the Greek language, there are 3 words that define the word iniquity. And we saw that in Hebrew, iniquity is given as a distortion of the moral law, and in Greek as a transgression of the moral law, which is basically the same thing. Distortion or transgression of God's laws of ethics in a way that uses violence. And then we saw that God's moral law, the true moral law of God, is the law of love, agape love, unconditional self-sacrificing love. We saw that agape is God's very essence, his nature is love. His agape love is independent of external stimulus. His love is not determined by the criteria of merit or demerit, worthiness or unworthiness. He loves everyone the same way and treats everyone the same way. So therefore, his love is indifferent to value. His agape love treats everyone in the same way. He is impartial. And his agape love is determined by his own nature of love. So we also saw that God desires from all his creatures the service of love, a service that springs from an appreciation of his character, and he takes no pleasure in a forced obedience. To all he grants freedom of will, freedom of choice. He desires voluntary service. And we also saw that the allegiance of love ensures perfect harmony. Jesus said that if he was lifted up, he would draw all people to himself. And that drawing is very different than to forcing. He takes no pleasure in a forced obedience. And the allegiance of love ensures perfect harmony again. And we also saw that God's great principles of righteousness are freedom of choice, freedom of will, voluntary obedience, and the service of love. Now, Lucifer perverted the freedom that God had given his creatures. He claimed that he could improve upon the statutes of Jehovah. He introduced proposed changes in the divine law. And so he introduced iniquity. Satan told God that God's mercy was inconsistent with what justice should be, implying that God's justice, meaning his agape love, was not good enough. He told God that every sin must meet its punishment. He said, "How can God give mercy to the transgressor and be just?" Satan had a new definition of justice, one that was based on the worthiness or unworthiness of the individual. So if freedom is removed, force takes its place. And if obedience is forced, obedience is no longer voluntary. Because of force, man no longer develops character. Through forced obedience, Satan perverted the freedom God had given us and all his other creatures. How does iniquity pervert God's great principles of righteousness? It removes freedom of choice. It removes freedom of will. It creates involuntary obedience and creates a service of fear and not love. Now, we are going to explore how iniquity flourished in Egypt because it's very visible there. And from the words of E.G. White, she brings Egypt into this whole thing. She says, "I am filled with sadness when I think of our condition as a people. The Lord has not closed heaven to us, but our own course of continual backsliding has separated us from God. And yet, the general opinion is that the church is flourishing and that peace and spiritual prosperity are in all her borders. The church has turned back from following Christ, her leader, and is steadily retreating toward Egypt. So we're going to look at the law of iniquity in ancient Egypt. Egypt is the type, and we'll see what the antitype is. Now, Exodus 1:8, now there arose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come on, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it come to pass that when there falls out any war, they join also our enemies and fight against us, and so get them up out of the land. Therefore, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramses. And the Egyptians made the children of Israel to serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, in mortar and in brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service wherein they made them serve was with rigor. Now all these things happened, and this is the antitype in 1 Corinthians 10:11, speaking precisely about the exodus from Egypt into Canaan. Now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. And that's our generation. In Isaiah 14:3 it says, and it shall come to pass in the day that the Lord shall give you rest from your sorrow and from your fear. This is speaking to the human race. And from the hard bondage wherein you were made to serve. So just so far, this verse is telling us that there's going to come a day when God will give us rest from our sorrow, from our fear, and from the hard bondage wherein we're made to serve in spiritual Egypt, which is Satan's kingdom of iniquity. When that day comes, we shall take up this proverb against the king of Babylon. That the king of Babylon obviously is a type of Satan. And we shall say, how has the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. The golden city, of course, is Babylon. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked and the scepter of the rulers. He, Satan, who smote the people in wrath with a continual stroke. He that ruled the nations. It's really important that we understand that Satan has ruled the nations in anger. He is persecuted, and none hinders it. The whole earth is at rest and is quiet. They break forth into singing. Yea, the fir trees rejoice at thee, and the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you are laid down, no feller is come up against us. No one has even come to take the trees away. And those are symbols, of course. So his kingdom of iniquity is characterized by sorrow, fear, hard bondage, oppression, and he ruled the nations in anger. How did Lucifer rule the nations in anger? Through his system of iniquity. The system of merit and demerit, the system of force and violence, the knowledge of good and evil. So, I want to take us back to when the Lord told Moses to take the people out of Egypt. This is what he said to him. And the Lord said to Moses, I have surely seen the affliction of my people, which are in Egypt, and have heard their cry by reason of their taskmasters, for I know their sorrows. And I am come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land unto a good land and a large land, unto a land flowing with milk and honey, unto the place of the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Amorites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel is come unto me, and I have also seen the oppression wherewith the Egyptians oppress them. Come now therefore, and I will send you unto Pharaoh, who is a type of Satan, that you may bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses answered and said, But behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, The Lord has not appeared unto you. And the Lord said unto him, What is that in your hand? And he said, A rod. And he said, and God said, Cast it on the ground. And he cast it on the ground, and it became a serpent. And we all know what the serpent symbolizes. And Moses fled from before it. Moses was filled with fear. And the Lord said unto Moses, Put forth your hand and take it by the tail. And he put forth his hand and caught it, and it became a rod in his hand. What does it mean to take the serpent by the tail? In Revelation 12:3, we read that there appeared another wonder in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and 7 crowns upon his heads. And with his tail he drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, and did cast them to the earth. So it's obvious that the word tail has a specific meaning, a symbolism that we need to find out what it means. If we go to Isaiah 9:14, it says, Therefore the Lord will cut off from Israel head and tail, branch and rush in one day. The ancient and the honorable, he is the head, and the prophet that teaches lies, he is the tail. For the leaders of this people cause them to err, and they that are led of them are destroyed. So we see how the tail is the symbol of lies. And Lucifer drew a 3rd part of the angels of heaven with lies and deception. And the lies and deception cause the people to be led astray and to be destroyed. The prophet that teaches lies, he is the tail. The leaders cause the people to err through the lies, and they that are led by the lies are destroyed. So, how did Lucifer's tail draw a 3rd of the stars of heaven, casting them to the earth? Through lies and deception. Moses taking the serpent by the tail is a type of how the serpent's lies and deceptions will be revealed before the antitypical Exodus. The lies began in heaven, as we have seen, and his tail drew the 3rd part of the stars of heaven, that's the 3rd part of the angels, and did cast them to the earth. He led them astray through lies and caused them to be destroyed, which they haven't yet, but eventually they will. And we'll see what's involved in that destruction. And the lies continued on earth and came to the Garden of Eden. And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. And here is already a prophecy. The creeping things are the serpents. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree in the garden you may eat freely, But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat of it, for in the day that you eat of it you shall surely die. Now the serpent was more subtle, more crafty, more cunning than any beast of the field which the Lord had made. And he said unto the woman, Yea, has God said, You shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees in the garden. But of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, You shall not eat of it, neither shall you touch it, lest you die. And the serpent said unto the woman, You shall not surely die. For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, then your eyes shall be opened, and you shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So Adam and Eve had been made in the image of God. They had been made with a character of agape love. They had freedom of choice. They did not obey God out of a forced obedience. They served Him out of love. They were impartial. They were faithful to God out of love. They had the allegiance of love. They lived in perfect harmony. They were pure. They had no double-mindedness. And there was no mixture of light and darkness in their character. Now, when the serpent came in, it introduced the knowledge of good and evil, a merit and demerit system, a reward and punishment system. There was a mixture here of good and evil, a contrary duality. It was impure because it had a mixture, and it was volatile because it could go one way or the other. It brought in confusion and violence. And that takes us to Babylon. The word Babylon means confusion. Babel, that is Babylon, including Babylonian and the Babylonian Empire. Babylon is a type of the kingdom of Satan that is mixed with this confusion of good and evil. So we're going to look at another antitype from Isaiah 14:4. You shall take this proverb against the king of Babylon, the king of confusion, and say, How has the oppressor ceased? The golden city ceased. So if we look at those two trees, you have the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The tree of life represents God's righteousness, His agape love. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil represents iniquity, Satan's system. Now, in the garden, every tree grew according to its own kind, except for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It had a mixture. It had two types of fruit growing in it. God's tree of life is characterized by a singularity. It only has one fruit. It is unchanging. It's unconditional and it's predictable. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil, on the contrary, has a contrary duality. It is changing. It can go back and forth. It is conditional, and it brings confusion. And it has two types of fruit. And so if we were to characterize Satan's kingdom, he gives no freedom of choice, because whether you get a fruit that is good or a fruit that is evil, both of them lead to death. The whole tree leads to death. There is no freedom of choice in death. There is a forced obedience there, because if you don't obey, you'll be punished. You serve out of fear of punishment. There is partiality, because now everything is based on merit or demerit. So you have the allegiance of fear, you have disharmony, and you have death. Now, I want to look at an ancient philosopher, Pythagoras, mathematician as well. And how he thought about the number one. He characterized the number one as being divine, as expressing the divine, and the number two as being devilish. Speaking about Pythagoras, there's Bepin Behari, who is a mystic actually. He said this about what Pythagoras came up in terms of the two numbers. He said, the odd, that is the number one, the odd signs are reckoned as divine, and the even signs, like number two, as terrestrial, devilish, and unlucky. Only one is good and harmonious because no disharmony can proceed from one. And that's referring to God's agape love. It does not change. The even or binary numbers are different. The Pythagoreans hated binary. With them, it was the origin of differentiation, hence of contrast, of discord, the beginning of evil. With the Pythagoreans, the duad, that's the number two, was that imperfect state into which the first manifested being fell when it got detached from the monad. So we could say that the first manifested being, it would have probably in heaven have been Lucifer, the first created being, it would be more precise to say. Or on earth, it would be Adam and Eve. So they entered into that imperfect state after they removed themselves from God's principle of unconditional love. It was the point from which the two roads, the good and the evil, the good in this case meaning agape, and the evil meaning good and evil, bifurcated. All that was double-faced, and that's good and evil, or false, was called binary by them. So we see the tree of life being one principle, unchanging, unconditional love, a divine part, pure and unmixed. Pure love, unmixed with evil. And that is something that God expressly talked about with the ancient Israelites. He gave them a few verses that were the most important verses. They were to speak those verses in the morning, afternoon, evening, before their children went to bed. It was extremely important. And they call it the Shema, which means, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." In Matthew, Jesus corroborated the Shema, and he said, when they asked him what's the most important commandment, and he said, the first of all the commandments is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord." We have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil being binary, having contrast, discord, and there you have the two types of fruit. A contrary duality, a double-faced, false system. So we have to ask ourselves the question, why did God take the children of Israel out of Egypt? What does the Bible say? In Leviticus 11:45 it says, "For I am the Lord that brings you up out of the land of Egypt, to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy." So God wanted to take them out because they were not worshiping Him in Egypt. They were worshiping other gods. And He wanted to bring them out so that He could be their God, and so that they themselves should be holy, just as God is holy. And if you look at the word holy, it's the word kadosh, kadosh in Hebrew. It means sacred. But then if we look at the word where it came from, H6942, we'll see what it means. It means to be clean, ceremonially or morally. And it also means to be pure, to be purified. So, to be holy means to be ceremonially, physically, or morally clean. To be pure without mixture. In Leviticus 18:3 it says, "After the doings of the land of Egypt wherein you dwelt shall you not do, and after the doings of the land of Canaan, whither I bring you, shall you not do, neither shall you walk in their ordinances." Now ordinances are laws. For they are, Leviticus 25:42, "For they are my servants, which I brought forth out of the land of Egypt. They shall not be sold as bondmen." These are the reasons why God brought them out of Egypt. "But the Lord has taken you and brought you forth out of the iron furnace, even out of Egypt, to be unto him a people of inheritance as you are this day." So, here are the reasons why he took them out of Egypt. So God could be their God, so they could be holy and pure, so they could stop walking after the ordinances of Egypt, after their laws, so they would not be sold as bondmen, and to make them a people of inheritance, and also to save them from the doctrines of devils. "For all the gods of the people are idols, but the Lord made the heavens." And idols are good for nothing, by analogy vain or vanity, specifically an idol, no value, thing of naught. And we saw before that iniquity is nothingness as well. And in Joshua 24:14 it says, "Now therefore fear the Lord and serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the flood and in Egypt, and serve the Lord." And what one nation in the earth is like your people, even like Israel, whom God went to redeem for a people to himself, and to make him a name, and to do for you great things and terrible for your land before your people, which you redeemed to thee from Egypt, from the nations and their gods. And then in Psalm 81:9, "There shall be no strange God in you, neither shall you worship any strange god. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt. Open your mouth wide, and I will fill it." But my people would not hearken to my voice, and Israel would none of me. So I gave them up unto their own heart's lust, and they walked in their own counsels. Oh, that my people had hearkened unto me, and Israel had walked in my ways. So Israel was walking in the way of the gods, following their ordinances and their laws. We have to ask ourselves, who were the gods of Egypt? There they are. They had many, many, many gods. The ancient Egyptian gods were usually divided into two camps. You had the male gods, like Osiris, Ra, Shu, all of these different gods. And you also had female gods. You had Hathor, you had Isis, you had Maat, and so forth. And if you look at these gods, they're usually related by marriage, and sometimes they're brother and sister as well. The god Shu was married to his sister Tefnut, and Isis was married to her brother Osiris, and Nephthys was married to her brother Seth, and these were all just symbols of something extremely important. Isis and Osiris will give us a very good understanding of what these gods were all about. All ancient Egyptian cosmic stories are embedded with the society's social framework. In other words, the society must conduct its practices in accordance with the same cosmic principle embedded in these stories. Isis and Osiris, the most common story to all Egyptians was that of Ausar, Osiris, and his family. There is not a single complete Egyptian record of it in all the recorded archaeological findings. Our knowledge of this model story comes from several versions that were written by the early Greek and Roman writers. The most common was the one told by Plutarch. A shortened version of the story of the Egyptian role model goes as follows. The self-created nether god, Atum, sped out the twins Shu and Tefnut, who in turn gave birth to Nut, the sky, and Geb, the earth, matter. The union of Nut and Geb produced 4 descendants: Ausar, which was Osiris, and Auset, Isis, and Seth, and Nebhet, Nephthys. The story goes that Osiris married Isis and Seth married Nephthys. Osiris became king of the land of Egypt after marrying Isis. The story sets the basis for the matrilineal matriarchal society. Isis is the legal heiress. Sorry, passed a slide here. Again. Okay, I think I've gone too far now. Osiris and Isis represent the principle of duality in the universe. Well, there it is. With Isis and Osiris, there is a harmonious polarity, brother and sister, twin souls, husband and wife. So what we are seeing is that Lucifer's principle of good and evil came to be represented by couples. And this can be found not only in ancient Egypt, but in Greece, where, for instance, Apollo was married to Artemis. And again, they represent good and evil. And in India, you have the same things. And they represented this principle of duality, iniquity, which Lucifer began in heaven, and with which he deceived a third of the angels. Okay, so Ignaz von Born was a contemporary of Mozart, and he wrote an essay comparing the ancient Egyptian priesthood with Freemasonry. And this is what he wrote. The Egyptians assumed that this principle, this polar principle, this duality, existed, and that these two were the main players that ruled or governed the earth. They assumed that the water that kept everything damp and was necessary for things to grow flowed from the benevolent Osiris, and the fire that destroyed everything was the property and characteristic of Typhon. So here the Egyptians gave water as a symbol of good and fire as a symbol of evil. Water symbolized the good principle and fire the bad principle. Later on, von Born reveals that the good principle was also represented by a downward pointing triangle, and the bad principle by an upward pointing triangle. This, of course, is evident in the Freemason logo. And if we go a step further, we get the Star of David, the good and the evil. If we look at our own age, there are symbols of this principle, upward and downward pointing architecture, the twin towers in the middle there. This is, of course, in Brazil. So looking back at Osiris, he was represented by water, the good principle, and Typhon by fire, the evil principle. And it's interesting to note that the two destructions of the earth happened by these two things, by water during the flood, and in the future by fire. So let's take a look at Osiris. He was considered beneficent he was considered the sun god. He was worshipped as a bull. He was a bull deity, as Apis. There he has the sun between his horns. He presided over the judgment of the dead, and he was lord of the underworld. He's also said to have invented the flute, which eventually we will show that this has an amazing connection to Lucifer as well. So if you look at a picture of Osiris, he's holding two things in his hands. One is the crook and one is the flail. The crook is on his left and the flail is on his right. There's the crook and there's the flail. The crook and flail are sometimes thought to represent two of the functions of the king. The crook stands for the shepherd, carer of the people, while the flail, as scourge, symbolizes the punishments deemed necessary to sustain society. See, Lucifer began a new order, a new universal order, which he hoped would have been universal, in which there is good and there is evil, there is reward and there is punishment. Isis, she was Osiris' sister and wife, and her name means knowledge, the knowledge of good and evil. You can see she also has the sun between her horns over there. And she represents wisdom, which is the same thing as the wisdom of this duality system. She also represents penal justice and nature, which is magic. Ignaz von Born provides the inscription that used to be on her picture column in the temple of Sais in Egypt. It says, "I, nature, bring everything that is and is to be. Nobody has ever completely unveiled me." And this is, of course, Lucifer speaking through these gods. He's saying, I bring everything that is and is to be. Nobody has completely figured me out, figured out my principle of good and evil. And we are going to show why we haven't figured it out. And that's because he makes God, the creator God, and Jesus Christ to be part of a similar type of Godhead in which God is the evil part where his justice has to be punishing, and Jesus is the good part, the love part. So, who were the gods of Egypt? According to Plutarch, a Greek historian, biographer, and essayist from around 46 AD to 120 AD, he said, Seth, Osiris, and Isis were not the events of gods, nor yet of men, but of certain grand demons, whom Plato, Pythagoras, Xenocrates, and Chrysippus, following herein the opinion of the most ancient theologists, affirm to be of greater strength than men, and to transcend our nature by much in power, but not to have a divine part pure and unmixed. For there are divers degrees both of virtue and vice, as among men, so also among demons. Empedocles said also that demons undergo severe punishments for their evil deeds and misbehaviors. So the word virtue and vice is another way of saying good and evil. This is a very puzzling statement that Plutarch is making, that just like human beings, demons also have different degrees of virtue and vice, of good and evil. And just like human beings, they also undergo severe punishments for their evil deeds and misdemeanors. So once they entered that principle that Lucifer deceived them with, they operate by that principle. So they will do good, they will reward men, but they will also punish. That was a pretty astounding concept at first sight. And the Bible happens to agree that that's what the gods were. In Leviticus 17:7 it says, "And they shall no more offer their sacrifices unto devils, after whom they have gone a-whoring. This shall be a statute forever unto them throughout their generations." So the gods that they were worshipping were devils. But Jeshurun waxed fat and kicked. Thou art waxen fat, thou art grown thick, thou art covered with fatness. Then he forsook God which made him, and lightly esteemed the rock of his salvation. They provoked him to jealousy with strange gods, with abominations provoked they him to anger. They sacrificed unto devils, not to God, to gods whom they knew not, to new gods that came newly up, whom your fathers feared not. So you see that those gods were actually devils, they were demons. So the Arabian Nights Encyclopedia says the following. In Arabian and Muslim folklore, jinns are ugly and evil demons having supernatural powers which they can bestow on persons having powers to call them up. In the Western world, they are called genies. In Islam, jinns are fiery spirits particularly associated with the desert. The highest of the jinns is Iblis, formerly called Azazel, the prince of darkness or the devil. The jinns are thought by some to be spirits that are lower than angels because they are made of fire and are not immortal. They can take on human and animal shapes to influence men to do good or evil. They are quick to punish those indebted to them who do not follow their many rules, who do not follow their laws. Now, if we look at the word Iblis, it says that it is the name for the devil in the Quran. Although the term devil comes from the Greek diabolos, the Muslims derived the name from the Arabic balasa, he despaired, which can be interpreted despaired of the mercy of God, but he is also al-Shaitan, Satan, and the enemy of God. Are we seeing any of these gods in our own time? Genies? Fairies? Are they teaching us good and evil? Are they teaching us a moral code where we need to punish the evil and reward the good? Are we teaching these things to our children? Are the gods present in our time? There was an Egyptian god called Yao. He was the upside down god. Yao was considered to be the counter image of the gods. A Jesuit Egyptologist called Mpei Kembali states that Yao belongs to the reversed world, which is the counter image of Mat. And Mat, we'll see very soon what Mat is. Thus, Yao is the epitome of evil. Yao is said to be reversed or upside down. In a footnote, Kembali observes how another Egyptologist, his name is Frenzen, interprets Yao. The most obvious interpretation of the evidence would therefore seem to indicate that Yao has a double nature. That the primordial Yao embodied the productive or creative, as well as the barren, irrevocable, non-existent of the world reversed. So here we have other ways of talking about good and evil. Good, productive, creative, or the non-existent, the evil, the reversed. Thus viewed, there would be a good Yao and an evil Yao. A being of that kind would be entirely consistent with the view of non-existence as worked out by Eric Hornum. And as we saw, the word iniquity has an element of non-existence in it as well. So you see, you have Yao, and that's where the word Yahweh came from. Or the word Yao came from Yahweh. It's a counterfeit of the true Jehovah. So Satan's law of duality in Egypt was represented by the goddess Maat. There she is. She holds a scepter in her right hand, and she holds a cross, the Ankh, in her left hand, that's supposed to represent the tree of life. But as we'll soon find out, she has this polarity, this duality. And so that cannot be the tree of life. That has to be the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. She also has a feather on her head. The goddess Maat represents the ancient Egyptian concept of truth. And as we read this, please keep in mind that this is all very deceptive language. It's the counterfeit that Lucifer tried to institute on earth. The goddess Maat represents the Egyptian concept of truth, balance, order, law, morality, and justice. Maat was also personified as a goddess regulating the stars, seasons, and the actions of both mortals and the deities, who set the order of the universe from chaos at the moment of creation. So you can see how Maat, representing a law, a moral law, a law of justice, a balance of order, a balance of good and evil, which is the purpose of which is to bring order. Egyptologist Maulana Karenga speaks of Maat. He says, Maat is right order, divinely established order. Again, counterfeit. And as such is the Egyptian concept of the arrangement and relationship that underlies and governs all aspects of existence, somewhat akin to the Western notion of natural law. There is a partial truth to this, because since Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Maat, or the law of good and evil, does govern most aspects of human existence. We all are born with that duality within us until we are reborn into Jesus Christ and his unconditional love for the human race. Moreover, Maat extends from the elements of nature into the moral and social behavior of mankind. That is correct. We all have this morality of, and when we see somebody evil, we want to punish them. When we see somebody doing something bad, we want to punish them. Maat as order is the principle which makes the whole of existence possible. And there, of course, that is not true, because Maat brings death. At the same time, it is a life-generating principle and force. Again, that's the opposite of the truth. So we see that it's claimed that good and evil is right order, that it is divinely established order, that it is natural law, and that it extends from affecting nature into the moral and social behavior of mankind, the principle which makes the whole of existence possible, the life-generating principle and force. So, a lot of deception there. Speaking about Maat, Simson Najovitz says, while the Maat precepts, Ankh on Maat, living by Maat, that is, primarily meant respecting the primeval order of the universe and of society, there's another lie, because the primeval order of the universe is not the knowledge of good and evil, but it is agape love. But he says, at least from the time of the wisdom text, they could also be understood as living decently, as doing the ethical thing. As such, it puts the ethical justification for a paradise into the hands of the Egyptians. Now it's saying that the Egyptians had the truth, they had the correct moral law, therefore it would be justifiable to put into their hands what it takes to create a paradise. They have the wisdom to create paradise. It even put the link between everyday life, ethics, and religion into their hands, since much in the Ma'at was an implicit moral code for this life and not just a criterion for universal and societal order and entry into the afterlife. So here again, this according to what they're saying here, you need to live by Ma'at, by the rules of Ma'at, the rules of this reward and punishment system, in order to even gain eternal life. The ethical aspects of the Ma'at in the negative confession of the Hall of Two Truths constituted a moral system. So, two things here. The Hall of Two Truths was the Hall of the knowledge of good and evil. They had such a hall in Egypt and in their belief system. And it constituted a moral system. Yes, it does. There is no question that good and evil is a moral system. But it's not God's moral system. David Adams Leeming says about Ma'at, in Egyptian mythology, the goddess Ma'at, the wife of Thoth, a god associated with wisdom, and daughter or aspect of the high god Atum, she is at once a goddess and an idea. And the idea is, of course, the knowledge of good and evil. The personification of moral and cosmic order, truth and justice. Justice, again, being the component of punishment, penal infliction. Ma'at or Mayet, like the Mesopotamian Me or Indian Dharma, that was as basic to life as breath itself, which in the coffin texts, Ma'at also seems to personify. So what it's saying here, that this moral law is as basic to life as breath itself. Again, so the opposite of the truth. Pharaohs held small models of Ma'at to signify their association with her attributes. Ma'at gives breath itself, life to the kings, and so is depicted holding the symbol of life, the Ankh, to their noses. Ma'at represents the proper relationship between the cosmic and the earthly, the divine and the human, the earth, the heavens, and the underworld. So this is now saying that God operates by this knowledge of good and evil, because Ma'at, the knowledge of good and evil, represents the proper relationship between the cosmic, that's God, and the earthly, the divine and the human, the earth, the heavens, and the underworld. Now here's another concept, the underworld, where the teaching of the immortality of the soul comes in. But that goes back to the garden where the serpent said, "You shall not surely die." So it is Ma'at who personifies the meaningful order of life as opposed to the entropic chaos into which it might easily fall. And the interesting thing that it is Ma'at that causes that entropic chaos, entropy. Because once mankind ate of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it ran away from God in fear of punishment. And when they separated themselves from the only source of life in the universe, which is God, they entered into an entropic chaos and eventually died. In some stories, it is the sun god Re who displaces chaos with Ma'at. When a person died, his heart was weighed against Mat's feather. A heart heavy with sin would not join the gods. So you see, right there. Mat was essentially in all Egyptian gods and goddesses as the principle of divinity itself. So here's the system of merit and demerit. If you are worthy, if you have lived a life without sin, you will join the gods. If not, you will not join the gods. And this is the opposite of what Jesus came to teach us. Jesus came to show us that God loves us all unconditionally and has unconditional forgiveness for all of us. The goddess Isis acknowledges the qualities of Mat as signified by the mat, by the ostrich feather she wears behind the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. Mat might be seen as a principle analogous to the Logos, divine reason and order. So, if you recall from the past segments, Lucifer wanted to change the law of God. He wanted to improve the statutes of Jehovah. And he wanted to create a new order. And so, through the God's teachings, he says that his knowledge of good and evil is a principle analogous to Logos, which represents Jesus Christ, the Word, the true Word, the Prince of Righteousness. As Christians are told in the beginning, the Word, again, Jesus Christ, already was, this is John 1:1, the God Atum announces that before creation, when the heavens were asleep, my daughter Mat lived within me and around me. Okay, so Atum, again, being a god, being a demon, this could be Lucifer speaking through him, saying that before creation of the earth, at least, when the heavens were asleep, my daughter Mat, his daughter, the knowledge of good and evil, lived within him and around him. Now, in Egypt, there was something called psychostasia, and that was the judgment of the dead. And this judgment took place in the hall of double righteousness, which was, of course, the hall of good and evil, where the law of good and evil was enacted. And here is a characterization of this law of good and evil. There you have the balance. On one side was put the heart, on the other side was put the feather, symbolizing Mat, which was the knowledge of good and evil, the law of good and evil, the code of ethics. And if the heart of the deceased had sin in it, it would sink lower than the feather, and he would not join the gods into eternal life. Seated to the right, seated on the throne, is Osiris, holding the crook and the flail. And these are other gods that preside over the whole scene. And by Osiris you have the law of Mat, and also you have Isis. Now, in the oldest book in the world, an account of the religion, wisdom, philosophy of the ancient Egyptians by Isaac Meyer, he says, the scene of the psychostasia, or trial of the earthly conduct of the dead, in the future world is very important because of the knowledge it gives of the religion of the ancient Egyptians. It shows the existence with them of a belief in a judgment after death of the soul or conscience for man's actions committed whilst in life upon this earth, that his good and evil deeds were thought to originate and reside in his heart. That man had, while on earth, free will in his actions, that his heart, emblem of his conscience, was after death mystically weighed by Thoth, symbol of the intellectual part of his spiritual nature. that he was subject to the accusation and opposition of a demon for actions done while in life on this earth, and after a decree against him to punishment by such demon and his followers. Now, if you recall, the word Satan means the accuser. Okay, so there he is with his principle of accusation. That there were certain specific faults and crimes for which he was liable to such punishment. And these his ka, or his soul, was obliged to state and show his freedom from, before the 42 assisting judges of Osiris, the death of the dead. That these faults and crimes were mentioned in the Confessions, in the book termed by Dr. Lepsius, of the Book of the Dead, of which the chapter or book, the scene of the psychostasia, is part, and that in number they were not less than 42. So that there were confessions that they had to confess, and there were 42 of them, and we will see what those are pretty soon. The Ma or Mat, that is, harmony, law, truth, righteousness, likely including an idea similar to the modern idea of the cosmos, and of that order which is conspicuous in the movement of the heavenly bodies, was believed to be the norm of the entire universe. It was believed to be the law of the moral law of the entire universe. That the principal desire of the ancient Egyptian was for his spiritual resurrection from the dead and an eternal future happy spiritual life in the Egyptian heaven, with perfect liberty to go where he desired. An absence of all punishment, and especially freedom from the danger of annihilation of his spiritual existence by the second death. So there it is, the judgment of the dead. There's the deceased heart and the feather representing Mat, the moral order. Now, Anthony Holmes said the following in a book called Tutankhamun, Speak My Name. He says, a feeling of rightness pervades the hall of double righteousness. The concept of divine balance flows from the complete one. And again, the divine balance, so-called divine balance of good and evil, flows from the complete. And that's an allusion to one of the gods, which is Lucifer himself. Justice and order are the watchwords that Atum must maintain. Atum has appointed his daughter, the goddess Mat, to be the personification of this wonderful concept of balance in the universe. A feather, a simple plume, is her symbol. With the lightest touch, Mat controls the balance between opposing forces of good and evil to the finest degree. No individual human strength or weakness dominates for very long. Clearly now, speaking of good and evil, the balance of good and evil. The goddess applies her feather-light touch to restore divine justice and order in the ancient land. And one of the things that the ancient Egyptians believed restored order in the universe was the application of justice, in other words, punishment. Once a person had committed a heinous crime, once that person was punished, they said that order came back into the cosmos, that order was restored. So this principle requires punishment. And here are the 42 ideals of Mat, of the temple of Isis. And this was a positive confession for the present day. There is Mat with the feathers, and if you put two and two together, she looks like the covering cherub, Lucifer. I honor virtue. Those are the positive confessions. Okay. I benefit with gratitude. I am peaceful. I respect the property of others. I affirm that all life is sacred. I give offerings that are genuine. I live in truth. I regard all altars with respect. I speak with sincerity. I consume only my fair share. I offer words of good intent. I relate in peace. I honor animals with reverence. I can be trusted. I care for the earth. I keep my own counsel. I speak positively of others. I remain in balance with my emotions. I am trustful in my relationships. I hold purity in high esteem. I spread joy, etc. Up to 41. It sounds good, doesn't it? And here are the 42 confessions. Hail, Uzek Nemt, who comest forth from Anu, I have not committed sin. I have not committed robbery with violence. I have not stolen. I have not slain men and women. I have not stolen grain. I have not purloined offerings. I have not stolen the property of God. I have not uttered curses. I have not committed adultery. I have not lain with men. Who comest forth from thy cavern, I made none to weep. I have not eaten the heart. I have not debauched the wife of any man. I have not debauched the wife of any man. I have not polluted myself. I have terrorized none. I have not transgressed the law. I have not been wroth. I have not shut my ears to the words of truth. I have not blasphemed. I am not a man of violence. I have not been a stirrer up of strife. I have not acted with undue haste. I have not pried into matters, etc. Up to number 41. So these two things, you had to recite them. They all sound good, but they're all salvation by works. In contrast, we see in the book of Titus in the Bible, chapter 3, verse 5, not by works of righteousness which we have done, but according to his mercy God saved us, by the washing of regeneration and renewing of the Holy Spirit. It is not the fear of punishment or the hope of everlasting reward that leads the disciple of Christ to follow him. Love awakens in the heart of the beholders. They hear his voice and they follow him. So, Maat in this picture is with Isis. And you can see how Isis is dressed in a snake outfit. She has a snake pattern on her dress. And Maat has the wings of Lucifer. Maat is holding the Ankh. Isis is holding the Ankh in her left hand, representing the tree of life, but it really is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And there it is, looking just like the serpent. Now, the feather is interesting too, because it's from that came the letter F. And the feather represents Lucifer, the covering cherub. God met with the high priest between the two covering cherubs above the mercy seat. And when Lucifer rebelled against the law of God, he created this law of good and evil. Now the order of Maat, also you have the two feathers there. You have the sun disk and the wings of the covering cherub. The order imposed in the world by the law of good and evil through the reward and punishment moral ethics. Now it's interesting because that symbol is everywhere. And here it is in the American Medical Association. You have the wings of Lucifer and the two snakes symbolizing good and evil. The system of the Medical Association does good and it does evil. There is always that duality included. And you can see that symbol everywhere. It is in Mercury. He has the wings of Lucifer. It is in Hermes. He is carrying a scepter that has the wings and the two snakes. Plus he has his hat with the wings and his shoes as well. But you can see that in other things like Adidas shoes. Good ear has the wings of Lucifer in the shoes. You just start looking at all the symbols and it's all there. Osiris's hat has the wings of Lucifer as well.